Thank you, Kate. I feel like you've done the work for me. That's amazing. Thank you. So I'm going to do this. There we go. It's always nice to have a pretty picture of some boys dancing. So it is an incredible thrill to be invited to speak to you this evening. And it is quite one of those things that, not growing up in Victoria, I was on the internet today sort of Googling who Redmond Barry was, which was enlightening, and I actually thought, oh, you know, what an extraordinary founding father of Melbourne that he was. And then really incidentally, but probably not so successfully for me, I also saw previous speakers of the Redmond Ballet lecture, which include, of course, Professor Patrick McGorry, AO, and Professor Adrian Clark, AC, and I started getting a bit nervous. And thought immediately, as one does when you agree to do these things, I really should have put more thought into this. But it is a great honour to be here, and I often think back to my early years, obviously as a young dancer, but I was also a remedial reader, and so I think my remedial reading teacher would be very proud of the fact that I was actually at this incredible institution speaking to you in a library. She probably would be excited that I could even read. So I guess the first question is, how does a young boy, a 6-year-old boy from a very middle-class family in Perth, grow up wanting to be a ballet dancer? And there is a bit of a story to this. My first memories of actually being you know, when you look back into your mind, what are the first memories you ever remember? And that is actually dancing in front of the TV. Now, I was one of 5 children. I was the middle one, so I have all of the neuroses. And because my elder brother was very sensible, as older brothers tend to be, my sister, my lovely sister who's here, thank goodness my parents had a sister. I have 2 younger brothers as well. I'd raffle them all for my sister. But mine was not the typical story of when you had a sister who went to ballet and dragged you along, because I was this weird little kid who used to dance in front of the TV. And I mean spinning around in front of the TV, looking at myself. Because, you know, in those days, the TV was a huge piece of furniture with a sort of shiny glass screen on the front. And I was not so interested until play school started in the TV. But I was very interested in myself on the TV. So I used to spin around with mum's tea towels tucked into my pants, and so then, you know, was immediately transformed into a ballerina. So it took me a little bit of a while to finally decide that ballet was the thing, but it was actually seeing some footage on that TV when it was actually turned on of the Australian ballet dancing Rudolf Nureyev's Don Quixote. Now, I think at the time I was quite impressed by Lucette Aldous, and probably thought that that's what I wanted to be when I grew up. I was about 5 at the time, so gender was a little bit fluid at that point. But of course, eventually when I did annoy my parents to the point where they finally sent me to ballet class, I realized walking into a group of 40 little girls in little pink leotards and me in my footy shorts and jiffies, because my parents, as you can imagine, being a sibling of one of 5, they weren't going to fork out for the expensive ballet shoes until they knew that this wasn't just a passing fad. So I was there in my jiffies and my footy shorts, and I realized for the first time in my life I had found my place. This was where I wanted to be. And in a way, it was all thanks to Rudolf Nureyev and probably Lucette Aldous a little bit more. But it was an extraordinary experience. I think you have those moments in your life where you actually realize this is your calling. And for a lot of people, that happens, you know, after much education and thought. Mine was walking to that little ballet studio in Scarborough with those little girls and doing ballet. So my father used to, he was the only one that drove in the family, and he picked me up. And for probably about 6 months of my training, I did it 1 day a week on a Saturday. And for every time he would come and pick me up, and he'd say, Mum would say, "Oh, how was ballet?" And I'd say, "Oh, it was really great." And Dad would always say, "You know, you don't have to go back next week." So eventually, when we got, to the end of the first year, I think he realised that he was losing battle, and I was going to be going back. But I was so excited, as I said to you, about doing this. I went into school, and you know how in those days you used to do that thing, what's news, and someone had a new baby and someone had a cat, and I put up my hand and said, on the weekend I started learning ballet. And there was this sharp intake of breath from the rest of the class, mainly from most of the boys. And luckily it was a co-ed school at that point. And but the interesting thing was, the tom-toms went through the school, and that afternoon my parents were dragged up to the Catholic nun, Sister Dominica, and she said, little boys shouldn't learn ballet, and told my parents that I wasn't allowed to go back. Well, that was the best thing. My father was a convert, and it was the best thing that the Catholic nun told him that his son couldn't do ballet, because from then on, I was in. My son wants to do ballet, no one's going to stop him. So I've got to say, to her credit, she did come along to the first concert. I really think she thought that I was going to be in a tiara and a tutu. And when she saw that there was some rigor and that I wasn't actually, mincing around in a fairy wing costume, I think she realised that she was probably mistaken. So 10 years of training with a wonderful woman, Evelyn Hodgkinson, led me to my first audition for the Australian Ballet School. The first ballet I ever saw was the Australian Ballet. It was Lucette Alders and Kelvin Coe doing Sir Frederick Ashton's Cinderella. And that was another earth-shattering moment, because it was a matinee. I went with my nana, as you do, as a young ballet student. And at the end of the show in His Majesty's Theatre in Perth, they used to open up all the doors. And I was so entranced in this beautiful, magical world that I basically was in. When they opened up the doors and all the light came in from outside, I had experienced my first cultural shock, because I really thought it was real, and it was almost like I was dragged from the theatre crying, because it was just a performance. So it was my first experience of live ballet, and that's, I guess, when I decided the Australian Ballet was where I wanted to be. So I remember this night, and this is going to sound like I'm making this up, but I swear on my dead mother's grave, this is actually what happened. I was 14, and my ballet teacher called my parents into the classroom after we'd done, and I was out the front of Gilder Cliff Hall in Scarborough, and she said, I think I've done as much as I can for David. I think he needs to go to Melbourne to the Australian Ballet School and audition. So, and I sort of was eavesdropping, because I'd been sent out. And I was eavesdropping, going, what's going on? And I was looking up at the sky, and it was, beautiful, very clear night, and I saw a star fall, and I, immediately thought Disney, When You Wish Upon a Star, and I thought, this is my omen. I wish that one day I will get to be at the Australian Ballet. So anyway, I went to the audition, and Dame Margaret Scott was there, and she said, what's your name? And I said, David McAllister. She looked down the list, and she said, we don't have your name here. I only found out later when I got home that my sister didn't post the application because she didn't want me to go. So anyway, I did the audition, and Maggie offered me a place at the ballet school, which was amazing. And then I got home and said, I'm going to the Australian Ballet School. And then my parents said, no, you're not. Because I was only 14, and they said, you can go when you finish school. And I was in year 10 at this point, because I was young for the grade. I was turning 15 the next year. So anyway, I wasn't allowed to go. And the next year, when the ballet school auditioned, I didn't audition because I knew I had to one more year of school. And Maggie rang my parents and said, where was David? Why wasn't he at the audition? I was like, yes! So anyway, in 1980, I went and auditioned for the proper time for the Australian Ballet School. And I walked in, and there was Stephen Heathcote, Paul Mercurio, and Darren Spowett, another dancer who I trained with. And I went, no! This was the important chance. This was me getting to the Australian Ballet School, and there's all these beautiful, tall, handsome boys, and there's no way I'm going to get in. So anyway, luckily, as thanks to Tinkerbell and the Falling Star, Dame Margaret Scott offered us all places at the Australian Ballet School, so I came to Melbourne in 1981. But interesting, a little precursor to that, I came on a family trip, you imagine, 7 people in a Holden Premier across the Nullarbor, coming to Melbourne, and the only thing I wanted to do in Melbourne was go to the Australian Ballet Centre, which is not that beautiful building that we have down at South Bank now. It was a converted tyre factory in Flemington. And my father was a bit nervous with all of the funny hook turns, but I insisted that I had to go. And so it was Friday afternoon, peak hour. You can imagine Flemington Road, a West Australian driver. It was a disaster. But I finally got there. It took us about an hour and a half from Carlton. And I got there and I said, okay, we can go now. And my dad was like, you have got to be joking. We are not going. You're not even going to go in? And I went, no, well, okay, I'll go in. So I peeked inside. I went like this, desperate that I didn't see anyone. Saw the poster of Dame Peggy Van Prague, who looked like a film star, and came out and said, okay, we can go now. And that was my first experience at the Australian Ballet. So only 2 years later, I was there as a student, and I graduated. Well, I sort of graduated from the Australian Ballet School in 1982. Got this little thing. My first performance was actually in Giselle. This wasn't my first performance. I was actually in the company by this. But I was lucky enough to be coached by Dame Peggy Van Prague, our founding artistic director. And in the end of that year, in fact, some of you might have seen there was a program up there. I graduated, I was part of the graduation performance doing Le Patineur by Sir Frederick Ashton. And Dame Peggy chose me to do the lead role in that. And that night was one of those special evenings, and at the end of it, Dame Margaret Scott came and said, I want to see you in my office at 9:30 tomorrow morning, to Stephen Heathcote and myself, and we were like, oh God, we're in trouble. It must have been a good show. So Dame Margaret, we arrived, and we realised that the third years, or at the graduate year, were having their interviews for the contracts, and we sort of were waiting till the end. And we went in there, and Dame Margaret was there with Marilyn Rowe, who was actually the caretaker director of the company before Maynard Gielgud joined. And she offered us 3 months secondments to the company as they were doing Spartacus. It was the 21st anniversary year of the Australian Ballet, and they needed an extra boys for Spartacus. So Steve and I were seconded into the company. And my first day into the company, it was the first day of Maynard Gielgud's time as artistic director. And so we did our first month, and then we did the performance, and then we did the second month, and then the casting for the rest of the year started going up, and our names were on it. And I said to Steve, do you reckon they know that we have to go back to the school? And he said, oh, I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't say anything. So we didn't say anything. And to cut a very long story short, I'm still there. So it was an extraordinary time to join the Australian Ballet. It was a very turbulent time. The company, just 2 years before it, had a major strike, and there was a real question about whether there would be an Australian Ballet. We joined at a time of great change of the company, and because so many of the senior dancers had left, there was a gaping hole in the middle of the company. And so we were lucky enough to be given huge opportunities. And so 83, Steve and I joined the company. First thing Maynard Gielgud ever said to me was, ooh, maybe you should have a nose job. Which then made me spend the rest of the time in never being in profile in front of Maynard. But I shouldn't say ill about Maynard, because I worked with her for 14 years. And during that time, for my first 5 years in the company, I was promoted each year to the next rank, which was an extraordinary opportunity. And she then sent this lovely woman, Elizabeth Toohey, and myself to the 5th International Ballet Competition in Moscow, which was a life-changing experience for me. And got a little picture here. Oh, it's a shame. You should see that hideous jacket that I wore on the Bolshoi stage when I got my bronze medal. That's me in a Stuart Membry jacket that I thought was so fashionable. It was 1985. I think a note to all young dancers, don't go fashionable when you get awards, because you live to regret it. But it was an amazing experience, and it was an opportunity that I really got to see the very best of the world's dancers in one place. And interestingly, Julio Bocca, who's sitting 1, 2, 3, the gentleman in the very nice, tasteful suit, he won the gold medal, and as life would have it, he's joining us in a week's time as a guest teacher. So you never know where these people that you meet at 21 turn up in your life. But it was an amazing experience. I feel that was the beginning of my understanding of where my career could go. And to see that ballet was not just something that I was passionate about and that I could sort of vaguely do, but it was a career and an art form and a profession. And so this really opened my eyes to what the possibilities were for the rest of my career. And I was very lucky then to have an extraordinary 18 and a half years of dancing with the company. I was invited back by Mr. Yuri Grigorovich with Elizabeth to dance at the Bolshoi. We were the second Australian guest artists at the Bolshoi after Kelvin Coe and Marilyn Rowe, who also, they won silver medals in Moscow. We won bronze, but you know. And Danilo Radojevic, who was another great dancer of the Australian Ballet, who spent most of his career in American Ballet Theatre, actually won the gold medal. So I figured the only medal I was going for was bronze because we already had gold and silver. So, but it was an amazing experience. And then, so in '86, we went back and danced at the Bolshoi again, but at the Kremlin Palace, and did gala concerts. '87, we did a series of concerts around in Vilnius and Tbilisi. And in '88, we were the first guest artist to dance at the Mariinsky, the first Australian guest artist to dance at the Mariinsky, which is sort of like a Melbourne dancer going up to Sydney and dancing. It was pretty tough going, but I've got to say, at the end of because we were seen as, you know, Moscow dancers, and at the end of the time, we had this wonderful experience where all of the dancers at the company, as the curtain came down, stood up and applauded for us, which was really lovely. So many cherished memories of my time as a dancer in the company. Oh, international tours. There's me on the Great Wall of China. Can't keep a ballerina down when there's a international icon. I wanted to jump up there and to prance around a bit. And I guess the thing that was so extraordinary to me from this, epiphany moment in Moscow is that the people you get to meet in this art form is extraordinary. We danced in '88 in Moscow with the full company, and that's another story actually. After our many little visits to Russia, the full company went back as part of the bicentennial of Australia, and we travelled to Moscow, St. Petersburg, and to Georgia. No, to the Black Sea anyway, and Odessa. Thank you. And when we got there, all of the Russian Goskoncert people who were inviting us to come back all the time realized there was a whole company of really good dancers, so that was our last tour as a couple. But Stephen and Christine Walsh and Fiona Tonkin and Adam Marchant kept the tradition of going back and dancing with these amazing companies. But yeah, so in 1988 we did this wonderful tour which went to the UK, and the Queen, it was a Royal Command performance because of the bicentennial with Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. That was me wearing rather a lot of makeup to meet the Queen. I think I had probably about 3 times as much makeup on as the Queen, almost as much as Maina. And then, of course, the various other things that happened. In 1992, we did a Royal Command performance in the presence of Her Royal Highness, as she was then, the Princess of Wales. And I got the opportunity to sit with her for 20 minutes and talk around the time that the Andrew Morton book came out, which we were told we weren't allowed to talk about. But it was an extraordinary experience. That picture I put in of Stephen is not me. I spent my career trying to look like that, never quite happened. But that was another major tour that the company did in 1990 to the Metropolitan Opera House in New York, where we did Spartacus and Giselle. And that poster was notoriously stolen from bus shelters all over New York. And people used to wait outside of the theatre with their texter pens for Stephen to come out and sign his bits. So, and the other little thing that I should probably tell you, which I shouldn't tell you, but I'm going to anyway, he's actually wearing the pants back the front. because that strap was supposed to be up the back. So I'm sure Stephen would be happy for me to tell you that. So a lifetime of dancing with the company was a great thrill. And in 2000, so Maynard Gielgud left in 97, in the end of 96. Ross Stretton took over in 97. And continued my career for another 4.5 years until he announced that he was going to the Royal Ballet in Covent Garden. And at that time, I had just started doing halfway through an arts management course at Deakin University. There was mentioned in the press, I don't know, I only found out much later that it was seeded by one of our former directors, Noel Pelly, that, I was one of the people that might be, in line for running the Australian Ballet. And little did they know, the person who wrote that article, that I had absolutely no idea or ambition to do that, except for the fact that Maynard Gielgud had said to me, one day I can imagine you running a ballet company. So as one does when you're 36 and think you know everything, I thought, that's a good idea. Why don't I, put some of this learning that I've been, text-based learning that I've been working on to practice and apply for this job. So I spoke to the chairman and he sort of patted me on the head and said, that's very nice. You'll never get the job. He didn't say that, but there was a tone. And so anyway, I applied for the job, as you do, and got through the first round, the second round, and then met said wonderful Mel Ward in front of the theatres building at Arts Centre Melbourne. And it was one of those days where I thought, Ian McRae, who was our fantastic general manager at the time, said, the chairman wants to meet you in front of the theatres building. And I thought, he's going to tell me that I'm not going to, someone's got the job and, that's fine. He thinks I'm going to fall apart in tears and didn't want to do it at the Ballet Centre. So we were walking towards Southgate and Mel said, we've done an international tour and as you know, you've been through the process, blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, just tell me, Mel, it's fine. And he said, so to cut to the chase, we'd like to offer you the position. And I've got to say, my legs went to water and I could have just collapsed on the spot. Heart palpitations. And as we walked to South Bank, he gave me the contract, he gave me the press release. He said, we're going to have a company meeting at 2:30 and then we're going to have a media call at 3 and then, they'll want you to be available for interviews. And I was like, right, thank goodness I wore my good clothes today. Because any of you who know dancers, we usually slop around in jeans and, tracksuits. But so yes, it was a whirlwind and then began my tenure as artistic director. So the $64 million question is, what on earth does an artistic director do? Many people give the artistic director so much credit for everything that happens at the Australian Ballet, but it is very much a partnership. And my partner in crime, I've had 4 of them. I'm very, I go through a lot of executive directors. But my partner in crime, the Australian Ballet after the strike actually is a dual CEO position. So the artistic director is in charge of everything that goes on stage. So the artistic director chooses the dancers, manages their careers. He or she looks after the artistic staff and manages the artistic staff. They look after the music department, of which my best and most delightful appointment was appointing Nicolette Frayon as our music director. She has been the most fantastic artistic partner that an artistic director could ever want, and thankfully she continues to be a great companion artistically, and so supposedly she is under my authority, but that never happens. And all of the medical team who support the dancers. So I guess the artistic director chooses the repertoire, manages the logistics of getting the right people at the right place at the right time to stage that repertoire, and then does a lot of things allied to the job. So lots of colour and movement and speaking, and doing those sort of day-to-day things which engage with our stakeholders, be it our corporate partners, our government partners, and our philanthropy partners. So it's a very diverse and extraordinarily fantastic job. I think, though, quite honestly, if I'd known what I was taking on in 2000 when I was appointed, I would never have taken on this job, because it is enormous and it is so broad in the scope. But it is also the most extraordinary job that one could ever have. I think the thing that's really interesting about a ballet company is it is the synthesis of all the arts, because if we just were on stage thumping around, it would be beautiful to look at, but not orally that enjoyable. So, of course, music is a huge part of what we do. At the Australian Ballet, we have a wealth of repertoire which is handed down through the years, thanks to Dame Peggy Van Praagh, Sir Robert Helpman, Anne Williams, Marilyn Jones, Maynard Gielgud, and now myself. They have amassed an eclectic and beautiful repertoire of over 300 ballets. But we also do, and have over the history of the company, commissioned many works. So many of our scores are commissioned. Obviously, the choreographers we commission. But equally, once you have dance and you have music, it's very boring, or maybe titillating, not to have the dancers nude. So we also work with incredible visual artists from all sorts of genres. That's the amazing thing. I think Serge Diaghilev, back in the beginning of the 20th century, really changed the idea of what the full, complete work of art for ballet is. I mean, before that it was, you know, dance, 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 mime, 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 dance, 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 dance. You know, everything was very formulaic. Serge Diaghilev told us that we can work with the greatest artists of our time, and they did, with, you know, Matisse and Miro and Stravinsky and Debussy, and created this wealth of great repertoire and inspired the future generations of artistic directors to think more laterally. So now, you know, we have choreographers who've never trained in ballet making ballets. We have artists who don't put pen to paper, creating digital forms and creating art spaces, installations that we can dance in. We have technology on stage that blows my mind, because I still have a problem working out how to make the computer work. But we now have this multifaceted installation technology that we marry the dance with. And then, of course, there's the stories. Without a story, there is nothing to do. I believe there is no such thing as abstract ballet, because George Balanchine put it the best. When you have two people on stage, you have a relationship. When you have three people on stage, you have a drama. And I think that's very much what happens. You know, even in the most abstract word, there's always something that has inspired that. And that's what choreographers, writers, designers, musicians, and dancers have all come together over these last 250, 300 years to create an art form which actually does encompass what happens in life. And I like to say, in Australia, you know, we're lucky that we have had this incredibly rich tradition of dance. Now, I also like to say that we are the great dancing nation of the world, which many of you might go, but everywhere you go in Australia, there is a pub, there's usually a Chinese restaurant, and there's definitely a ballet school. Even Kate, in a country town of 80 people, there's a ballet school. There's a dedicated man or woman, probably more likely woman, who is educating and teaching those kids how to inhabit their body and to be future physically knowledgeable people. And I think that's what I am so proud about. The tradition of ballet in Australia has been one that is handed down to us from various tours. I mean, very early back, even back into the 1800s, we had Paris opera dancers coming to Australia, staging performances in the newly built theatres in Australia. And in fact, the other thing that blows my mind is that there were more pianos per head of capita in Australia after colonisation than pretty much anywhere else in the world, which is, we are an artistic nation, and we sometimes like to think that we just have corks on our hats and kick footballs, but we are an incredibly forward looking and successful producer of great artists and great dancers. I've got a little cheat sheet here. You don't have to read that, I'm going to sort of quote things. The Australian Ballet, starting from humble beginnings back in 1962, with only 45 dancers and I think an annual budget of something like £10,000, something like ridiculous amounts. We are now an $80 million business. We employ 275 people. I'd like everyone to know we have 166 female employees and only 109 male employees. We are very unequal opportunities for the men. There are 4 very different businesses that make up the Australian Ballet. Obviously the ballet company, which is what you see on stage, performing across the world and doing usually roughly around about 200 and, what have I got up here? 243 performances in 2018. But alongside that, we also we are the Orchestra Victoria is a wholly owned subsidiary for the last 4 years of the Australian Ballet. So we have an orchestra. We have a car park. Now, many people who come to work in the arts don't ever think that they're going to run a car park. But the car park annually raises a huge amount of money that goes into the operational budget of the Australian Ballet and means the artistic director can spend more money. And we also have a foundation, which, depending on which particular day of the week you look at, is anywhere between $55 to $60 million. So there are 4 distinct operations that make up the Australian Ballet. You might be surprised, or maybe not surprised, to know that only 12% of our annual funding comes from government. So 88% of the funding of the Australian Ballet actually is through earned income, which is, as I've said, made up from the car park, the rental space at the ballet centre, but more importantly, government funding, but more importantly from philanthropy and from earned income. So we are a very commercially run organisation, and we are also one of the hardest working companies, as I said, 243 main stage performances, regional performances and story time. So we have 3 brackets of what the company do: the Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, Brisbane, sometimes Perth, sometimes Canberra seasons that we do. But we also have a regional tour that tours for 6 weeks every year in regional areas around Australia. And then we have a Storytime Ballet, which is our children's access program. So that adds up to 243 performances with a company of 77 dancers. Now, the only other company in the world that does anywhere near as many performances as us is both the Bolshoi and the Paris Opera. The Bolshoi has 250 dancers and the Paris Opera has 155. So we are, and I like to say to my board, we are the most productive ballet company in the world. We may not be the biggest, but we definitely are the most productive. We have also been really aggressively in the social media space. And in social media terms, there was a shining moment, I don't know if it's still, but we're still working towards it again, that we were the #1 ballet company on Instagram. So if you want to follow the Australian Ballet, it's hashtag #ausballet.com. No, just hashtag #ausballet. And it's been something that's been a really important part of what I've believed for the future of the company, because we are relatively isolated from the main stages of New York, London, Paris, Tokyo, Moscow. But we are in everyone's computer or phone. So we've been very aggressive in that. And one of the things that I'm so proud about is also the World Ballet Day, which we do every year with partnering with the Royal Ballet in Covent Garden and the Bolshoi Ballet in Moscow. And interestingly, I should put my my glasses on, but I'm too vain to put them on. There was something like 5.5 million people across the globe that logged on to World Ballet Day to see the Australian Ballet giving rehearsals and preparing for classes. So I feel like the most important thing that's happened in my tenure at the Australian Ballet is that global reach of the Australian Ballet. We have done 30 international tours in our 57 years, which is a pretty high strike rate when you think that some of those tours, there were changes of directors and things in between. I've been lucky enough to lead 10 international tours in my time as artistic director. And the Australian Ballet has an incredibly strong international reputation overseas, but it's often intermittent. So the way that we've managed to build that profile for the Australian Ballet on the world stage is through social media and through cinema broadcasts. We have had a number of our productions go out into cinema. And in fact, last year we did The Merry Widow, which was seen by over 13,000 people across both North America and Europe. So I've been really so excited about making the world aware of our new generation of young dancers. I think the future for the company is also really exciting because we are at a time where culturally within Australia, there's a lot of things that we can be offering to make the Australian society even more exciting and interesting place. We're not saving lives, as I often say to our dancers, get over yourself, you're not saving lives. But the wonderful thing that we do is we transport people into another world. And while we may not be saving lives, we might be taking those wonderful researchers and medical scientists into another world and resting their overactive brains to do something creative in a different space. I think the other thing is when you think that 1 in 4 children are overweight at the moment, 2 in 3 adults are overweight, there is a great opportunity for dance to be the future for young people to discover their fitness. When you think also that there's over 3,000 dance schools in Australia and 800,000 kids every week who do dance, we are actually trying to help build that momentum for experiencing health and well-being. The other great thing is that 1 in 6 Australians, well, not great thing, one terrible thing, is 1 in 6 Australians experience emotional loneliness. One of the things that is the great catalyst for that is building community, and there is nothing more fantastic than dancing. In a group, by yourself. It builds your your well-being. It builds your strength and health and well-being. So I see the great future for dance in Australia being not only going to the ballet and seeing a show, but interacting with ballet, dance, in the most general terms, to really excite and enlighten and engage the future of Australia. Because for me, what I aimed to do when I first became the artistic director was to build that sense that everyone in Australia has the sort of pride that we have for our cricket team, when they're not cheating, our Olympic team, our rugby teams. I don't particularly know anything about rugby, and I wouldn't even know if they were doing well or not. But I'm really proud of the fact that we have one. And I know there's a hell of a lot of people out there who have never been to a ballet and probably are really not that interested to go. But what I want to do is make sure that they are really proud that they have one of the world's great ballet companies here in Australia. So, thank you.